So just a quick overview of the WBA. So we're the Life Science Trade Association. This is actually our 25th anniversary. We were formed in 1989. We're a nonprofit 501c6. Our mission is to help support and grow life sciences in the state of Washington. We have over 650 member organizations. Northeastern, very proud to have them as a member, but there are 650 organizations statewide. Life sciences is one of Washington State's, I think, I like to say, our best kept secrets. One of the fastest and fastest growing and largest industries in the state. So without further ado, I'd also like to acknowledge our sponsors, and that is We Work for Health, and Andrew Wells here is with Nice Communications and representing We Work for Health. And also, again, I'd like to thank Stephanie and Northeastern for hosting us. So, all the bios and the agenda are on their chairs, so if you have any questions, we're not going to introduce each speaker formally. Their background information is in your handouts. And I'd like to introduce now the first speaker and moderator of our program today, Dr. Kenneth Fang, who is the Chief Medical Officer and Vice President of Translational Research and Clinical Development at Integrated Diagnostics.
I'd like to thank the WBA for inviting me to moderate this session, and for all of you for coming, and also for sharing your extending invitation. I thought I'd share a little bit of my background first and sort of tell you why I'm so excited to moderate the session. So I'm a physician scientist by training, so I was a lung specialist and also a specialist in intensive care medicine. And so I've seen the whole gamut of patient care from inpatients in extreme also to outpatients. And so one of that is understanding really the consequences of disease and health and the entire spectrum of disease, from really end-of-life issues to things like smoking cessation, which we were talking about as a group. And so one of the things that I'm particularly interested in is this real emphasis on the term wellness, because we use the term, we're all in biotechnology, we're in the healthcare business, so really caring about health, and yet my whole training and most of my focus was actually not healthcare, but disease care. And so really what the shift now is that rather than saying disease care, we're actually now going to focus upstream or proximal to the process and talk about the care of health, or the preservation of health, or the prioritization of health. So I think that's actually very interesting for me. My background as a scientist has been relevant because the last 10 years I've been in biotech, and I've sort of inadvertently focused on diagnostics, which is really about understanding, for me, how the molecular aspects of the body, how they contribute to understanding disease processes, eventually lead to diagnosis. So for me, the other aspect of this is eventually trying to diagnose or to prioritize wellness through understanding the molecular aspects of the body. So we'll be hearing things about that from our speakers. So focusing more on the wellness aspect, I think that I'm intrigued by the term wellness because I think it's something that we all aspire to. And in the various discussions we've had beforehand to prepare for this, there's been a couple themes that I'd be interested to hear what the audience has to say, and I know our speakers will be addressing them directly and indirectly. But the first is what is the definition of wellness? Is it, because there's somewhat of a dichotomy, you need to be well or not well. So how do we actually define what wellness is? The second is everybody understands that it's a good thing to be well, but the other hard thing that we all know about in our daily lives is actually it's difficult to be good. So what is the motivation for people to embrace wellness, to actually adopt the changes in their lives, to be well? The other thing that's also hard is that once you are well, how do you maintain well? And so we have experts to discuss that. And then the last thing is how do you measure that? What are the standard wells? So you can lose 20 pounds, or you can cut your cigarette smoking by a half pack. But there's other things that we'll be hearing about today that are trying to address the various aspects. So I think that as you're listening to the speakers, I think there's a lot of things to take note of. And we actually have a question and answer period at the end, which I encourage you all to think about, to generate questions for the panel as the presentations finish. So with that, our first speaker is Sean Bell. He's the business director here at the Hypercade Project at the Institute for Systems Biology. I'll let Sean tell us what he's interested in.
Thank you. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sean Bell. I'm the business director here at ISB, which actually, is literally right here. So it's not a big commute to get here today. Sort of functionally, and where this project, or what ISB, how it fits into this discussion is sort of a really intriguing one for me. I came from a company that worked primarily in the area of health, wellness, and management of individuals who were trying to fight things like quit tobacco. So we ran a company called Free and Clear, which was a company that developed as a venture capital funded group here within Seattle. We grew it ultimately to the point where we were working with about 300,000 to 400,000 individuals per year, about 1,000 people per day proactively enrolling in our tobacco cessation programs, where we're using components of cognitive behavioral therapy, motivational interviewing, support for medicine in the form of nicotine replacement therapies and some prescription drugs to help people deal with the challenges, the psychological challenges, the physiological challenges, and the behavioral challenges of quitting using tobacco. And we're really successful at what we did. Probably best in the world, definitely in the country on how we did that. By the time we left, we had over 250 coaches working 24/7, 365 days a year in this area. And we were very, very comfortable with what created behavior change. So when I joined here, I've been working with Lee as a consultant around this little project. If you know Dr. Lee Hood, you know there's no little project. Really was to take it to the next level of what could we do with this whole opportunity around big data and all the new tools that are being invented, many of them being invented here at ISB, to funnel them through and create a personalized data cloud for each individual that was meaningful to their wellness and to tracking their disease transitions. And ultimately, if we could track those disease transitions at a pre-symptom level, either arrest them, reverse them, or at least mitigate them. So the project, when I first heard about it, I was like, this is a boil the ocean strategy and it's going to go nowhere. And I sat down with Lee and I said, this project's going to go nowhere. And I didn't know him all that well, and so he kind of explained to me, that this is exactly what he does. You know, he takes big swings at the fences and sees what can happen. And so the 100K project got launched, and I'll tell you some specifics about that now. But it got launched with this concept that had to be more than just metrics. I'll talk about the metrics in a minute. But what we've understood about wellness is that it's a squidgy term because wellness is an individual term. Frankly, diabetes is a classic example of something that we objectively call something diabetes, but there's nothing objective about diabetes in the sense of why is 100 the number that if fasting blood glucose makes you diabetic, 99 is not. Right? That's silly, right? If we had a conversation about that, we'd all agree that's silly. And yet our entire medical care system is based on drawing somewhat arbitrary lines in the sand around what is disease and what is non-disease. And wellness is even more challenging because we get into these discussions all the time about, you know, what is being well. And so one of the components of developing this 100K project was understanding that ultimately what we needed to do was to tie an approach around metrics and behavior change that tied to each individual's core values. And we'll talk more about that in the QA. But understanding that fundamentally, wellness is a continuum that is defined as to how you define wellness, with support from a coach, or support from someone that can help you think a little bit bigger in different ways. So the 100K project took that as a fourth axis point to its project, and we moved forward and we started this project. And so what is the 100K project? Well, it's ultimately going to be a Framingham-like study, 20 years in length, approximately, where we'd like to enroll 100,000 well individuals, and I put that in quotations because it's going to be a continuum, where we're going to take whole genome sequence, take blood 3 to 4 times a year, although we think that may be a little too, we're taking 60 milliliters of blood, so I'm arguing whether or not we're going to be able to do that for too long. We're taking stool samples, we're taking urine, we're taking saliva, multiple times a year, and we're running metabolomics, proteomics, microbiome, talk about whole genome sequencing, traditional clinical chemistries, and then quantified self-data in the form of your activity data, your sleep data, your nutritional data. And we're building a database that we're going to load this in and build a series of algorithms that ultimately will allow us to create metrics for you as an individual on an N-of-1 basis to talk about your wellness, where you are today. Track those metrics, see where they're trending. We know over time some of you are going to trend into disease, and our goal is to track those transitions, capture them at the molecular level, and then be able to see whether or not those transitions can be reversed, mitigated, or in fact were stopped. It's a huge project. The amount of data we're dealing with on an individual basis is pretty substantial. When you start scaling it up, it's even more substantial. But leaving Lee, we launched this project, and we've enrolled 108 people in the Pioneer 100 program. And that program is set up to really focus on figuring out the basic logistics, how things will work, how we're going to scale this, and working up some of the basic science. So that's been launched in March, and we're about 2/3 of the way through, and we've had phenomenal results. We found that literally, no matter where anyone was, we were dealing with a lot of people who were well, every single individual in that project has something that's actionable, something that they can change to make them, to optimize their wellness and their health. And so we've been able to now create a series of analytics that we're using to drive down to the coach, and the coach is working with the individual participants at a level right now to help them take that information, create actionability, make changes in their lives that we've been able to measure in subsequent blood samples to see whether or not that change is happening. And interestingly enough, in many cases it is. We're seeing substantial changes in nutritional components like vitamin D, certain areas of inflammation, prediabetes, cardiovascular disease, all percentages that we're seeing pretty high percentages of folks who were at risk. We found 2 diseases in 108 people. One person was diabetes, was diabetic, and would not have been diagnosed in the traditional medical care system because they're not obese and had no family history. But the person has type 2 diabetes. We had another person who had a genetic disease called hemochromatosis, which is pretty rare. So we were really surprised, and we caught that, the coach caught that, when they saw, we look at ferritin as a level 1 indicator of inflammation. Ferritin levels were way off the charts. It didn't make any sense for this person. And so upon recommendation, they went to a physician and ultimately were diagnosed. So you can see that the power of what we're doing is exciting, but we're just getting started. And our goal really is to build an infrastructure in place that will allow us to scale this project to 100,000 individuals, many of whom are going to be enrolled via sort of classic academic collaboration, but we're simultaneously launching a for-profit standalone company that will take a lot of what our findings are and engage at the consumer level. So that's the basic overview of what we're working on, why we're choosing to do it, and we'll talk more during Q&A.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. So our next speaker is Steve Quintelli. He's Associate Professor in Computer Science and Health Science at Northeastern University. In my discussions, or our group discussions with Steve, is going to be sharing some of his interest in the assessment and metrics of aspects that are associated with wellness.
Okay, so I'm pleased to be here. My background is I started off doing computer vision when I was in graduate school trying to get computers to see. And then when I finished, I was at MIT. I actually worked at a research group at MIT in the Department of Architecture on homes of the future, and realized if you're going to create homes of the future that are useful for people, you want to focus on aging in place. And over a 10-year period, my research group evolved, and research evolved into doing work on using sensors, not just cameras, but other types of sensors, and now mostly wearable sensors and mobile phones, using those for health and helping people stay healthy. And then a couple years ago, I moved over to Northeastern to work in personal health informatics. We have a number of faculty there who are working in this type of space. So I guess the point I want to try to make here is that there's a lot of really interesting stuff that's going on in genomics, like we just heard. But in order to interpret that data, we really need much more sophisticated computer software and systems and models of people's behavior. So one of the reasons on the news that you hear things where this week you should eat chocolate, this week you can't eat chocolate, this week you can drink caffeine, this other week you can't drink caffeine. The reason for that is because the way that we measure in science, and particularly in health, is really poor. So I don't know if anybody's ever taken a food frequency questionnaire, but this is what the type of questionnaire they use in the Framingham study. So they ask you this excruciatingly long list of impossible questions to answer. So how many cups of tomato sauce do you typically eat in a year? Can you really answer that type of question? And when you sit down, I was, as a sort of a technology person who came into health, when I first sat down and started taking these surveys, and now I've done a lot of them because I teach a class in advances in measuring behavior, when you sit down and do them, you realize how poor they are. And so in some cases, it's amazing that we can actually see any signal at all, given that there's so much noise. So one of the ways that some of us at Northeastern think that we can most advance health science, essentially, or our understanding of health, is by better measurement tools. So if you think about other areas of science, a telescope, right? You invent a telescope and then a whole new area of science comes around, right? You invent a microscope and you can suddenly understand things in ways that you can't before. We actually don't have very good tools for understanding people's behavior. So we're working on trying to figure out how do we get computers to create something I sometimes call a behavior scope, right? Imagine that we could understand people's behavior at the level of their sort of minute-by-minute decision making. It would never be possible to do that without technology. But with technology, with mobile phones, things, little sensors you wear, Fitbit, that type of stuff, if we can figure out how to make the right algorithms, we can probably figure out how to get those devices to have a better and better understanding over time of your particular pattern of behavior. And your patterns are different than your friend's patterns. And those patterns of behavior are absolutely critical to understanding anything that we would learn about your genome. Because we know that you might have a gene that predisposes you to alcoholism, for example, but depending on the environment that you're in, that may or may not become active. Right? So we have to understand what you're exposed to, what some scientists would call your exposome. Okay? So that can be toxins, but that could also be your physical activity, your sedentary behavior, whether or not you're getting exercise, whether or not you're taking medications, whether or not you're driving safely. Okay? These things impact your health. And we don't have particularly good ways to measure them. And computers are possibly going to give us an opportunity to measure them at a much finer grain scale than we can today. So the trick is, if I have a mobile phone in my pocket and I might have a watch on my wrist, for example, the trick is how do we go from that, which is sort of noisy sensor data that a computer kind of gathers, how do we go from that to a model of I'm cooking, or I'm socializing, or I'm exercising, or I'm bored, or I'm depressed. Okay, so the things that we want to know about people, we have to somehow take this messy data we get from the computer and then have algorithms that somehow interpret it, and then over time figure out what it is I'm doing. And that's essentially what my research is about, and some of the faculty at Northeastern are about. And so we're trying to figure out how do we do that at an individual level, and then ultimately how do we scale that up to a population. If we can do that, I think we'll have some pretty serious advances in our understanding of health that otherwise are just going to be impossible. So you can only get so far just understanding the genetics. You really have to understand the other half of the equation, which is what are people doing. Okay.
Thanks, Steve. So our final speaker is Christy Clark. She's the Wellness Account Executive at Parker Peak. And so we've had some very interesting discussions with Christy about her current and prior work, focusing at a slightly different approach, which is at the organizational level, for instance, at hospitals and businesses, and how people may address wellness from a group function. And some of the things that are just in terms of metrics, but also incentivization and motivation. Christy.
So I am looking at this on more of the group level. Mostly from the employer level in my current position. So employers have a financial interest in the health of their employees, keeping them healthy to be productive employees, and as well as they're paying for their health insurance most of the cases. So very financially motivated. So, and most of the working population, from an individual level, we spend 8+ hours a day at work. It's a lot of time. So there are influences there that impact our health. The slide above talks about what behavior is influenced and kind of at what level. So the upper part, public policy, has kind of the broadest 10,000-foot view and has the ability to affect the most amount of people. Things like vaccination laws, seatbelt laws. Next is the community level. How we're influenced in our communities, whether there are safe places to eat, whether there are sidewalks, public parks in our neighborhood where we can move around. So I'll be talking more about the organizational level, again, hospitals, workplaces, schools, what's available to eat, how much we can move in those places. The interpersonal level, what's our peer group, family life? Do we sit down and eat meals together? Are our friends our walking partners or our drinking partners? How does that affect our health? And then ultimately, the individual level, behavior choices are up to the individual, and when we can use devices and information that we're going to hear about more about. I mean, we can make choices with these other influences on our health. So I've had the great experience of working with the Cleveland Clinic the last couple of years on their employee wellness plan, and they had a good amount of success with their plan starting in 2005, where they just started with making a smoke-free campus. That was their first baby step. How do we influence the surroundings for our employees? From there, they went to making healthy food in the cafeterias where they're labeled Go Green. So things that were the healthy choices were easily labeled, and they made those less expensive than the non-healthy choices. That progressed into various areas of the organization and eventually to their employee health plan, where their premiums were different based on healthy choices and where they fell on a health spectrum. So employees were categorized in one of three ways. They were healthy, they had a chronic condition, or they had missing information. And every employee got a letter telling them their health category and what steps they needed to do in the next year to get a discount on their premium. And the premium, there were all three levels: gold, silver, and bronze. To get the gold level, you had to participate in, if you were considered healthy, you had to do a weight management program or walk a certain exercise, a certain amount. They provided pedometers to keep track of steps, or you could go to Cleveland Clinic gym 10 times a month, and they tracked all of that. If you had a chronic condition, you were enrolled, or you had the opportunity to enroll in a coordinated care plan where you would work with a coordinated care nurse that would help you, coach you with your health goals and set targets to make, to achieve that discounted premium. And then the people with missing information, they either didn't turn in the health forms, didn't pay attention, didn't know this was happening, or didn't care, thought it was too big brother, stay out of my business, I don't want any part of that. And that was fine. But the health premium differential for a family was about $1,400 a year. So it was real money. And I noticed the culture there, it got people's attention, and people were walking at lunch. My office was in one of the call centers, and weather's not always great in Cleveland. And so there was a lot of space inside to walk, and big groups of people were walking on their lunch breaks and regular breaks. And I was certainly self-conscious of what I brought to lunch meetings, because people were so anyway, in 2012, they were able to save $15 million on their healthcare spend of a budget of $370 million, and that was they didn't make any benefit changes that year, so they could attribute it to what they were doing with their wellness. It wasn't popular with everyone, but it seemed to move the needle. For the people with the chronic conditions, in looking at data over the years, people enrolled in the coordinated care plan, the cost flattened and even went down somewhat. And in looking at the rest of the population who were identified with chronic conditions or missing information, those costs continued to escalate with medical trend. So, fascinating. Their goal was to meet people where they were with their health and keep the healthy people healthy, and help people who had chronic conditions manage those and try to improve. So, again, it starts with the individual, but when an employer puts things in place that reduces barriers to healthy living and provides incentives, it can be a starting point, at least to influence your behavior during those 8 hours a day at work. So, be happy to talk more about what they did and how they did it and how it relates to your businesses and or these other options.
Were you gonna do some more?
No, that's fine.
Just start out? Okay, thanks. Let me turn on the microphone right now. So I can warm up.
I mean, just.
Can you hear me without the mic?
Do you need the mic, Megan, for him? Yeah, we're videotaping, so it does help with that. You're on, okay?
Well, thank you all. Those are very interesting insights. One of the things, so I mentioned sort of my personal interest as the moderator, so I'll be using again in terms of the I'm interested in, well, there's a lot of things I'm talking about. One is the definition of wellness. The second thing is the motivation for wellness, which is something you address. And the third is actually, many addresses the assessment or the metrics for wellness. And there's a couple of interesting themes that I'd like to sort back. So I guess in terms of the definition, so I forget it was either Sean or Steve talked about this because it's the 100 cutoff. It's interesting. Historically, many conditions in health versus disease are actually defined by a quantitative things because it's easy for us. And I think that, so one of the things I want to talk about is data, and I'm sharing with my colleagues, I think that we are, and our group is very data-driven. And one of the things that you two mentioned is really, how do you marry objective data in Shanti's molecular data versus, and Steve case, sort of whatever you use your measurement with whatever device, with the clinical data or the clinical state. So I'll start that up. So each of you can perhaps comment on that first and get Chrissy's thoughts. So the question is how will you, or what options you have to blend the clinical and where objective data is collected?
Well, I think one of the things we need to sort of be very clear about when we think about this is thinking about the fact that a lot of our healthcare system approaches are very reactive rather than proactive in approach. So it's fairly clear-cut sort of post-manifestation to start measuring and saying, okay, here are symptoms that we're tracking. What we're not particularly good at in a health system perspective is sort of proactively looking at trends before someone gets sick and then trying to figure out what to do or how to work with them within the system. And I don't know if the system actually will ultimately change that. So if the system will ultimately change, or if people are just going to change, and this is going to be more of an individual consumer offering. This has a lot to do with how changes are happening and how people buy and purchase healthcare. But I think fundamentally, what we're hoping to do over time is to build a perspective where dynamical snapshots of molecular data gathered from a wide range of areas can be integrated and correlated in a way that we can develop specific metrics that matter for individuals for certain healthcare symptoms. So if you had, we can look at it in a couple ways, right? One is you would say, okay, you are very high at risk based on your family history and looking at your whole genome sequence, you have a high risk for developing type 2 diabetes. So based on knowing that risk, you don't have it yet, here are the metrics that we're going to track for you. And it may be more than HbA1c. Maybe we're going to look at insulin resistance. Maybe we're going to look at a wide range of metrics. We're going to do it in a way that's defined and agreed to. And we're going to find a way, first and foremost, to tie those metrics back to something to you as a patient that you care about. Because frankly, for most people, let's face it, the piece of pie in front of me today has immediate utility. Right? It's tasty. The threat of type 2 diabetes in 20 years has no utility because the fact is I can choose to forego the piece of pie tomorrow. Now, I'm not going to, but I will convince myself that I can. And so just tying it at that level, I think, is something that we need to really change up. So there's a psychological component of reframing the problem set with an individual to make it specific to you. And then there are agreed upon metrics that we believe give a good constellation view as to transitions, and then try to manage that proactively. This is very much tied to the cost of collecting this data going down. It's a change in paternalistic perspective around physicians being more comfortable with patients having data that may be a little squidgy at times.
So maybe my specific question, I'll ask another way, is for the 100K study, I know you did the pioneer trial studies. Have you predefined what the wellness definition is by any metric or non-metric basis?
No.
Or are you going to derive the wellness?
Yeah, so our goal is to derive these wellness metrics. And we've got some real intriguing early findings around these areas in inflammation in particular, but also in prediabetes. But we're just scratching the surface of what we want to do. And I think the debate we're going to have is going to be a fundamental one around not just understanding what the metrics mean, but coming to some level of agreement that there's going to be a philosophical debate on the meaning of some of these things. I'll just give a very specific point, then I want to turn over to Steve. There was a big debate today. I led a discussion group on the 100K project, and one of the debates is vitamin D. We have a lot of people in our group, in this Pioneer 100, who are really low vitamin D. Lee Hood thinks it's a really valid metric. He really wants us to track it. He's really excited about it. Several of our scientists think it's bunk. And they're basing it on one set of studies that would tell you it should be set much lower than it is, and then there's a whole group of studies. There's a philosophical debate there. I mean, it's not, there's no right or wrong answer because it's semi-subjective. We're never gonna know, because for you individually, it's gonna be this. For me, it may be this, based on certain things in me. So I think a lot of these debates and discussions, these metrics are gonna have to be thought of objectively and subjectively and presented in a wide range of delivery mechanisms.
Steve?
So I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question exactly. I think that it's a little dangerous to get too caught up in the clinical, which as an MD that might make you nervous. But I think there's opportunities to create effectively new types of biomarkers that we don't have today. So there are people looking at things like, can you detect whether or not somebody might have early onset of dementia by the way that they're typing on a keyboard. So if you imagine how many hours a day you spend typing on a keyboard, and you look at the pattern about the way that you type, that it might be that there are very early indicators in that become our next sort of great medical tests. So in the class that I teach on advances in measuring behavior, one of the things I do is I go back and we look at something like blood pressure. If you look at blood pressure measurement and the way that it was introduced, there in major journal when it originally introduced, people said this is crazy, this is useless. And it took actually almost 100 years before the measurement got good enough to be useful and people understood that it was useful. So now we have these new technologies, we want to measure things. How do we figure out that it's useful? I mean, to some extent, you just have to start measuring. And if you start measuring enough, you're going to start to see that some of the arbitrary lines we've drawn in the sand aren't really there. We thought they were there, but they're not really there.
Well, and that's exactly the genesis of my question, which is again thinking about, so since I can't wear my clinical hat, skills, my scientific hat, which is there has to be, when you do your data analysis, then you have to have some idea of what your analytical reference is. So here's an example, right? So in terms of deriving wellness, okay. So if you took an investigator from Africa and you plot in the United States today, he would, if he randomly assessed the population in a study, 35% of his people would be obese. Okay, so in that population, if he didn't know anything about the U.S. population, his curve would be different. So he would incorporate that obesity into some relative norm, right? If that was his only indicator. So my point is that so that for the 100K study, for whatever you're doing, you both reference like Alzheimer's and sort of early cognitive issues or weight, and Chris mentioned that too, walking. So my point is when you define the 100K, you have to be careful about defining, if you're going to derive wellness, your population as it's selected will define what that wellness is depending on how that population is selected. And there's inherent biases in terms of universities or clinics or outpatient versus inpatient follow-up settings in terms of primary care versus internal medicine. So that using the obesity example is that you could in fact have a mean BMI that's greater than average, and that could be normal if you randomly picked 100,000 people in the United States if you're an investigator who knows nothing else about the U.S. population. That's what I'm saying is that there has to be some, you have to be informed by what is known. Yet I think it's great that you're going to try to define wellness. Maybe I'll sort of, in addition to what we have is finding new metrics at the molecular level or whatever to find that. So Chris, what do you think?
Well,
Like how did you know what weight cutoff to start
right.
rewarding incentives?
So they used, there it is again. So they gave people the benefit of the doubt. So over 25 BMI is considered overweight, and they set their metric at 27. So saying, okay, you are considered, so of the chronic conditions, I don't know if I mentioned that before, the chronic conditions are BMI of 27 or above, hypertension, hyperlipidemia, asthma, tobacco use, and diabetes. So those were the chronic conditions where you needed to go and put your care. And so BMI was usually the most controversial because someone would get the letter, they call it the fat letter. And you get the letter, and the clinic didn't call it that anymore. And so they would get the letter, and there was of course, a process that they could go through to appeal. And so the phone call would come in. I got the letter, and it says that I have that I got a fat letter, and the person on the other end of the phone would say, "Oh, our information indicates that you have an elevated BMI of 27 or above. Is that true?" And then, the person would go into a long story, I lift a lot of weights, and, so yes, it is true, and here's why, or, oh, yeah, maybe I should cut off this or that. So I think you need to have some kind of metric that is a base level, and I do think that individuals are individual, and their circumstances may be such that they're on one end of the scale or the other based on their circumstances, and so, but you do need to have a target.
No, I think the other aspect that's both clinical and scientific is that when you design any kind of study, is that one thing you have to address is what the current norms are, what the current standards are. So if you go to quote publish, you need to understand, as you're talking about the vitamin D, is what the reference, what's accepted versus what's not accepted. So the question I have for all of you in a slightly different vein is so Sean, you mentioned about what the ISB is doing in terms of the samples you're collecting, whether it's urine and blood or stool, and so again from a biomarker, that part of my hat. The question I'll ask each of you is are you collecting and or measuring the right things to define what wellness is? In other words, wellness, you will then bias your result by why aren't you measuring the CSF, spinal growth, or why aren't you measuring other things, teardrops, why aren't you measuring pulmonary aspirated things? Because those are all going to be fluids. You just happen to choose not to sample them for whatever reason, either difficulty, cost, or inconvenience.
So obviously of the chronic conditions, those are all things that impact health, heart disease, etc. But one thing that they weren't measuring necessarily was stress. And a lot of the employers that I work with now, that is a common factor among employee days is stress. Depression is another. And so those aren't on that continuum of the things they're measuring. They often go along with some of those things with comorbidities that relate to metabolic syndrome, but they're not necessarily things that are measured that do impact greatly on productivity at work.
So I think you have to measure as much as you can and then figure it out. I really think that's the answer. So oftentimes people make decisions about what to measure based on cost, right? Or it's too hard to measure it. And then sometimes we don't develop tools that allow us to then easily measure some things that might be important. So I think one of the opportunities is that we're starting to be able very inexpensively to measure lots of things, sort of biological sort of measurements and also behavioral sort of measurements. And if you then put those together, we may discover that in some cases we're measuring a bunch of stuff that we really don't care about, right? BMI is a big deal because these things are a big deal because we can measure them and they're the only things that we can measure. And so other things that, sort of to get at wellness, I mean, part of that is going to be about how somebody reports on their quality of life. And that's part of the measurement, but it also ultimately relates to how long they live because we assign a value to long life, right? So, there's the sort of concept of your lifespan and the concept of your health span, right? And there's sort of an inherent assumption that if somebody lives healthy and they live until they're 45 and they die, that something was wrong, right? But they may have had a high quality of life. We're saying we're going to assign something was wrong because they died what we consider to be early, right? But you could also have a case where somebody lives a very long life in a lot of pain and it's very uncomfortable, and we're in some sense saying, well, that was better because we kept them alive. And what's not really in there is the quality of life. And so I think as we measure all these things, we also measure behavior and we measure quality of life, and then it helps us understand which of these measures are what's making a difference in somebody's life.
I would just add, one of the things with the 100K project we have to continually remind ourselves is just to be very wary of orthodoxy. And what I mean by that is we know we're taking steps. We know it's not all inclusive. I mean, I can sit down with Lee and he will give me 4 more assays that he wants to run with this group. We're not doing enough with epigenetics. He wants to do white blood cell, he wants to do stem cell, nanopore, he wants to do cell by cell, and because he's an immunologist by training and he thinks immunological reactions are going to be key to understanding wellness. He's right, but we just can't afford to do it right now. I mean, just to give some perspective, the tests right now with overhead associated with that are costing us per year $12,000 per individual. I mean, this is just not something that you can say, okay, and so we're not doing transcriptome yet, so we're not doing anything with microRNA. And there are people here who are up in arms about it at ISB. We're doing some really, really basic microbiome analysis. If anyone's into microbiome, we're doing 16S rRNA sequencing. It's boring. It doesn't tell you much. It's giving you phyla, and it's sort of giving you species, some differentiation, but it's no nuance to it. But metagenomics is going to be costly. So we know we have to advance this ball forward in some way. And as the cost of the assays come down, we're going to be knocking assays out all the time. You know, I'm not convinced that we're at a point yet where the measurement of the 200 peptides that we're doing for proteomics, that many of them are organ specific, are going to give us all that much actionability. I hope they do, but I just don't know. And if it turns out that we've got a lot more discovery to do before we can create actionability at a participant level, we'll back burner that for now, and we'll focus on that which we believe is measurable, is some level of creates a wellness metric that we believe is meaningful to the individuals, and something that we can coach and work with and see whether or not we can change it. There's going to be things coming in and coming out all the time, but you have to measure it long enough.
Yeah, and I think that what she said about you'd like to measure everything, I think that is the ideal. I think that Sean's back to the practical is actually that you can't. And I think that what Chris talked about is really some of the, I'll call it, for lack of a term, the cognitive perception of wellness, or the cognitive self, and this is what I'm sort of getting towards the motivation. If you took a random sample of people in shopping mall who have a BMI elevated above normal, they think they're fine. They think they're healthy, they're well. So it's arbitrary whether it's 5, 10, 15, 30% above BMI, right? If you survey them, why am I in this study? I'm well, but I have nothing to change. I'm perfectly fine. And culturally, it's even greater disparity in terms of what's perceived as either aesthetically versus functionally well versus not. So it's a bit arbitrary, and that's what I'm saying in terms of the measurement aspect comes down to partially a technology, but I think it comes down to, again, my scientific bias is you have some idea of the future, even over a 20-year period, for instance, of what your data analysis plan is going to be. You'd like to know, in the end, the quality of your analysis is going to depend on how clearly you define what those metrics, even empirically first, because you know they will evolve over time. But I think that how do you incorporate, because we've done very similar things that are quantitatively based and scientifically based, but I think that there's a lot of interest in patient self-reporting for symptomatology, for instance. People can be, quote, obese, but feel fine. And then when you say, well, how far can we're taught, can you go food shopping by yourself and push the cart? Oh, no, I can never do that. Well, that's obviously a functional limitation, but people don't realize that that's actually an easy way to assess people's function. Can you climb one flight of stairs? You can't do flights of stairs, right? So that actually has quite reproducible value for us as a physician. We document that in our chart. That's not generally part of studies that I've seen. So I think that what I'm interested in terms of wellness is really how do you define it, particularly for a fascinating scientific study. When you do that final analysis in the end, the quality of your association and coefficient value should depend on not only your molecular samples, but also how well you define that clinical.
Absolutely. And, we're using standard reference ranges for a lot of the nutritional chemistries and clinicals. You have to, right? Because you start out somewhere. But a lot of what we're doing as well is we gather a lot of we do a lot of psychological surveys at the beginning of people's perceptions. We can tell you in tobacco cessation, for example, the two leading indicators of success when you talk to somebody is how they would measure their confidence level and how they measure their motivation level. Those two metrics alone tell us a heck of a lot as to whether or not they're going to succeed or fail in their attempt to quit using tobacco. And we can coach to that. So you can develop metrics over time. And those two metrics we collect a ton of data about individuals at free and care. Right? Those were ones that we found over time became statistically significant. And that's what you're looking for, right? Over time, as you look at a whole wide range of metrics and you start drilling down on, okay, these correlations are significant. I mean, BMI is a great example. If you are Japanese, for example, you're at greater risk of getting diabetes at a lower BMI than Caucasian. That's the genotype, and that's the way it plays out. So BMI as just the only indicator of whether or not you're going to develop a health condition is a really blunt tool. I mean, and this is so much of what we're doing. We're still in the Paleolithic phases of wellness here, right? We use very blunt tools. We use them in pretty poor ways, and we're functionally missing the big picture because we're focusing on individual metrics rather than trying to look holistically. So you spend a fair amount of time up front defining what is holistic wellness for each individual, and you spend time, to your point, the key question shouldn't be just about your fasting blood glucose. It is asking those functional questions. Because when you ask somebody, are you worried about type 2 diabetes in 10 years? They'll say no. But if you say, okay, well, what really drives you when it's exciting to you? And they're like, well, I love playing with my grandkids. And you say to them, wow, you know, that's awesome. So what would you do if you couldn't do that anymore? Okay, well, that starts a whole, well, you know, I would be awful. So, you know, that begins a debate, but that's a core value discussion. It's not an objective metric. But that becomes the basis to then you give them something to keep an eye on and track over time.
And you know, you mentioned, just as an aside, you mentioned the expense of $12,000 for doing the lectures. I can tell you that doing an hour-long standard history physical, you have to assess flights of stairs. Can you walk? Can you still walk do a half-mile hike? That takes a lot of time, and I guarantee you it'll turn out to be much more than $12,000 a year from just say patient interaction sort of thing. The other area that I thought would be interesting, since some of you mentioned it indirectly and directly, is in terms of wellness, is the influence of the intrinsic or endogenous versus the extrinsic. That we talked about sort of intrinsic, sort of quote, your predetermined / genetic, without biasing and thing, aspect versus the environment. Then the third thing, environment broadly, but the third thing is cultural. So if you come from a family, certain cultures where they do enjoy food and entertainment, right? Should that person get extra 29 BMI to get that instead of 27? Because in their family, it's normal to be like that. If you come from a family of smokers, right? If everybody from 3 generations smokes 2 packs a day, it's normal for them to smoke, even though it's not, the minute they walk out of the house, it's not, right? So these are extreme examples, just for food for thought. How do you account for that when you're defining wellness? And Sean, for you, because it's such an important thing for us as scientists, when you're picking even a huge set like 100K subjects, how do you know at what point will you check in your enrollment that you don't have a bias, or you do have a bias in the patients whom you enroll, either by ethnicity, as you mentioned, or by one of these other arbitrary things about familial, not genetic, but habitual behaviors that may or not contribute to wellness?
Well, I'm going to assume we have bias. I don't think you can avoid it. We all know, you can be as objective as you want. At the end of the day, there's always bias injected into whatever you're doing. So you have to sort of know that going into it. We spend an enormous amount of time dealing with things like cultural attributes and how they play a role. You can objectify a lot of this information, but you have to just go with what you can start with. And for some people, wellness is not going to be defined in the beginning by what they're eating. Like that's just too much, and that's okay. That doesn't mean you can't get them on a journey of discovery where eventually something like that can be introduced to be brought into play. We know all these components play a role, but for some folks, just getting them to say, hey, tell me a little bit more about your family activities. What do you do? And how do you enjoy your time together? And you start to pluck out things that can lead to more activity or can lead to eating healthier and getting people to think about that. We have to accept the fact societally that we put ourselves in this position, and it's going to take a long time to get ourselves out of this position. And what I mean by this is, we get 2 points to think about. In about 1950, approximately 50% of males and about 25–30% of females smoked. Does that sound about right? Roughly. Today, 19% of males and 17% of women smoke. In fact, probably less than that. We denormalize tobacco through public policy, through taxation, through employer mechanisms, and we've been able to change it and create a society where we're effectively starting to get to the point where we can see an end to people using tobacco. E-cigarettes, you can argue whether or not they're good or not, but at the end of the day, it's a harm reduction methodology that may, in fact, in the long run, lead to substantial changes in the use of consumable tobacco. On the opposite side, we've allowed 40 years of food policy and 40 years of sort of perspective on what is health and wellness to allow us to get to this point of being ill. I mean, I was just reading an article a few months ago, I think it's Charleston, South Carolina. There's so many type 2 diabetics in the African American population at this point that it's just referred to as having sweet blood.
Right. No, it definitely isn't. Chris, what about in your programs? How do you address this?
So,
I'm working with the
so geography is interesting and with a group right now that has a very different population in the Seattle area than it does in its Kentucky plant. And the things that we do with them to engage employees are completely different. So there's a heavy smoking population in the Kentucky plant. It's a tobacco growing town, and they eat a lot of fried food. And so we'll be working on different things with that group than we are with the Seattle group. So we definitely take into consideration culture of different regions.
I think the opportunity in terms of technology is that the more you can measure and the better of a sort of richer picture you have of somebody, the more you can think about automated counseling tools or semi-automated counseling tools that are going to respond to whatever somebody's situation is. So the idea that there's sort of this one thing fits all, that's going to work for everybody is a naive approach. In some cases, with a family member, they can help you make certain changes. In other cases, they're harmful in terms of making changes. And so until a person or a system understands enough about what's going on, it's very difficult to think about inserting interventions. But there are a lot of opportunities out there for technology to help gather that type of information. I mean, you talked about the fact that the type of data you would want to gather on somebody of going up and down the stairs and all that would be very time consuming and expensive. But the things that you said are exactly the types of things that I think folks are working on now to gather just in the course of everyday life. And so it wouldn't take any time at all to gather the data about going up and down the stairs, for example, if you're sort of always gathering that data.
Yeah, and I think that from a history-taking point of view, the reason I bring up that example is because if I ask a patient or a person, I said, "Are you short-breath?" They say, "No, I'm not short-breath." And I say, "Well, how many flights of stairs can you climb?" "What do you mean? Like, you mean get to the top?" And like, yeah, of 3 flights. No, I can't even get to the one. It's like, and I say, well, so then you learn to ask the question, well, how many steps can you make? Well, I can generally do 5, right? And so part of the skill that you learn as a physician is that it's just like when you're teaching, you never say, "Do you understand?" Everybody always says yes, right? And so you don't ask a patient, "Do you smoke?" You say, "How many packs a day do you smoke?" "Oh, I don't smoke," or five packs, right? Or how many flights, how many steps can you climb? So these are skills that we're taught as medical students, right? So I think that kind of it's self-reported, but it's qualitative. I think it actually is informative, and I guess it's probably more reproducible than just a quick survey sort of thing. The other aspect of wellness that all of you talked about, I think is interesting, just because of this particular country, is cost. Is it worth it for us? So in terms of so Chris's perspective, the organizational level, and for each of you, so we're spending money on trying to define it, trying to refine it, and we're trying to measure it. So is there a way, either from your perspective in terms of grant writing, or even from how do you pitch this to institutions or even to urban centers that, you should invest in wellness because blank is your return on investment, or it has this dollar value, and is that relevant or not?
You want to start? It's time for Laura.
Sure. Well, I think the cost thing is a tricky issue because initially, actually, when I started getting into this, and one of the arguments that some of the folks in technology would make is that we're helping people stay out of the hospital, and that's true. And for some period of time, it's a huge cost savings. So there's just billions of dollars that are wasted just because they're in the hospital, they don't take the medication, they end up back in the hospital, right? So those would be cost savings. But on the other hand, if you help somebody live a much longer life, since it's sort of exponentially increasing cost at the end of life, it's not necessarily the case that if we introduce a whole bunch of wellness technologies and people are actually much better off, and then as it is, it's predicted that 1 out of 4 women born today are going to live to 100, right? So if we have lots of people living to 100 and they get to that very late and very old age, they're going to become very expensive. And so I think at some point you just have to say it's worth it to spend money on something that's improving the quality of life of people while they're living. Again, the sort of health span thing. But it's not necessarily the case that keeping people healthy saves money. In fact, with insurance executives, a lot of times when they come through, as they come through the university over the years and we talk to them, there are things like employee wellness programs. They don't really think of it as something that's saving them money. They think of it as something that's helping with their marketing, because when they're honest about it, they say that people can switch between plans, and so it's not them keeping people healthy isn't it's a marketing thing, is the bottom line, which is kind of sad, right? Not,
What do you think
not
of
what
that?
we want.
So, yeah, I've got an opinion on that. So return on investment for wellness is a long-term endeavor, for sure, because employees move around a lot. The average employee stays, or the person stays with their employer 3 years, so, and it takes 3 years at least for behavior change and to see health benefits of behavior change. So it's a long-term investment, if you will. But if lots of employers are doing it and the overall population's getting healthier, then I think that's where you get the return.
But if you're an insurer and I stay with the insurer and I live longer, I'm ultimately going to cost them more money.
Or you're gonna pay premiums longer, and you might still die fast and not use a lot.
Well,
You're not necessarily gonna get in the hospital.
The optimal person is somebody who's healthy and dies of a heart attack and sick. That's the optimal customer.
So, yeah, you might, but, yes, we age and we use more healthcare as we get older, but does it balance out or not?
Sure.
Well, I have kind of two things to add to that. Having worked in an industry that sold to employers and worked with health plans, I can tell you for sure this was, the dirty little secret in wellness programs. And it always used to drive me nuts because, the reality is that, to your point about sticking with an insurer, well, actually, no, what happens is the vast majority of us move to Medicare. And at that point, we're the government's problem, which means it's our problem. And if these commercial plans have done nothing to actually keep you from becoming diabetic, type 2 diabetic, well, we all bear the burden of this cost in the long run society. So, we kind of gotta think of it that way. But there's sort of two elements to the whole cost issue that I often will talk about. One is, I don't care that we're spending $1 in $5 in the United States on health. What's wrong with spending 20% of our GDP on staying healthy? There's nothing wrong with that. Like, honestly, we don't need another, GDP does not need to be reoriented towards another Facebook or another iPad. The problem we have is that we're spending it in an inefficient and costly way where we don't feel like we're getting a lot of benefit for our spend. But the fact that we're, everyone's like, oh, we gotta bend the trend and reverse the cost. I'm like, no, we just need to spend it differently and spend it better. I mean, if we want to drive down the cost of healthcare, it's not that complicated. Turn off people when they get sick and don't take care of premature babies. That will knock a lot of money out, but that is not an ethical or moral thing that as a society we have chosen to embrace, which is great. But those are the sorts of issues and challenges to deal with. From a science perspective, what I would rather reorient the conversation towards is the very issue of how do we keep people more productive? How do we keep people happier? How do we keep people more contributory in terms of what they can bring to society? And we do that by keeping them mentally and physically healthy.
So Sean, that's actually a nice segue to maybe the last question before the open general session Q&A, which is this has to do with two aspects, which is the measurement technologies. But I think the key question I would pose now is monitoring wellness. In other words, presuming that you can achieve it, right? How do you maintain it, and then how do you assess the maintenance of the monitoring? So, for instance, with molecular technologies, the key question is always, what is the sensitivity, what's the limit of detection you need to prove that whatever metric you're using is stable, so that by vitamin D, you're well or you're not well. And then the other thing is how do you motivate somebody for you to show them their vitamin D level every day or whatever things that, oh, you're doing well today, where you get on a scale every day, right? So I think that is actually, it's either costly or it's cost savings, depending on the maintenance of wellness should ideally save money, but there's probably a cost to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, the marginal cost of tracking and monitoring is going to essentially get down to zero in the next several years from a technology perspective. We're seeing, the cost of a good sensor these days to track some pretty sophisticated biometrics is dropping down into the pennies, and it's going to continue to do that. We're seeing a huge change away from just accelerometer-based approaches, and that's all good. The fact of monitoring is one thing. The motivating is a totally different issue. And so instead of thinking of it just as like, okay, can we monitor? Sure we can. The real question is really paying attention to what you care about now and creating a small view of you for that issue. So at this point in my life, I'm an active runner and cyclist. And so one of the things I'm really worried about is injury prevention. And so there are genetic variants. If Stuart came down in Stanford, has about 169 genetic variants that they have correlated using GWAS that have strong correlation to things like my proclivity towards an ACL rupture. So I can look at that genetically, understand that there's a risk there, and then I can coach myself to avoid that sort of information and then monitor it. In a few years, neurodegenerative concerns will start to raise their head because I'm 44, going on an age where I need to start worrying about that. So those are the sorts of things that I'm going to want to monitor and watch over time as well. So what are the right metrics for me at that point in my life that will motivate me? And so I think that's the issue for each of us is, paying pretty close attention to monitoring and motivating as two separate problems or two separate challenges and focusing on the motivating first. And then driving down to how to monitor that in a cost-effective way.
Don't you think that monitoring can motivate?
I think it does for a short term, and I think that human behaviors, we get bored really fast. And it's just, when we get normalized to the data. How many of you use a Fitbit or anything? Okay, how dynamical is the data? Right? Most of us walk, whatever it is, you walk 8,000 steps yesterday, you probably are walking 8,000 steps today. Now, this is a self-selected group here. I'm sure there are a lot of, there's at least one or two quantified self folks. I've seen one around here. But when you get to the average population, Fitbit usage is a little under 4 weeks. Basically, when it runs out of batteries, people put it there. I mean, it is. Steve, what do you think? This is your thing.
Yeah, I think that's mostly true, and that's the hype. I get concerned about the hype in terms of the fitness market because the companies really just care about selling the devices, but getting people to use the devices long term is a big deal. So there was one called the Zio, which helped you with sleep monitoring, and that I didn't even know. I'd say a bigger problem than the Fitbit. You wear it and it's interesting for a night or two, and then after that it's kind of the same thing every night. And so again, quantified self types of people tend to say this data is interesting for data's sake, but most people don't really, right? So the trick then is, what do? People assess a very rich understanding of a person's context and situation, and then they in a very targeted and very creative and intelligent way, they insert feedback. And that's the thing that's difficult. We're trying to learn how to get computers to do that. So one problem is they need a rich enough model of the situation to be able to do that. And then the other problem is they need to be able to sort of do it in a creative way. And just showing people graphs of their data is not a particularly creative way.
Well, I wonder, so my question is the decades we've had one scale as your monitor. And you step on it once a week, once a day, it tells you, your X, right? And then there's other things like home blood pressure cuffs and all these things, and I often wonder, do people really use them? They're asthma monitors, it's barometers where you can track your flow volume per minute, you can sort of track them. People bring them in and we say, record it every day, once a day, and it actually does help. But that's a highly motivated patient who will do that and actually not make up the data, right? So I think monitoring, in my experience, actually it may not, it gets people to think about their health, right? So that's what I'm saying in terms of it ideally is positive reinforcement that what you're doing, if your weight stays stable, then you're doing something correct, right? That's my point about how monitoring can help motivation.
Well, there's no question that monitoring leads to behavior change up to a point. But your scale example is a good one, because if I do weigh myself every day, that's going to help with behavior change. But at some point, for many people, weighing they know that they're going to get an answer that they don't want, and that's a disincentive to weigh, and then they stop, right? So it's no longer sort of positive. It's not a positive thing anymore. It becomes a negative thing. So you need to be a lot more creative in order to get people to do that.
So Chris, is there some way that the organization, you actually can redirect that so that the scale becomes a positive?
So 2 points I want to make. One part of the data monitoring that I find fascinating is on the aggregate level with groups when we are monitoring trends and we see people moving from one group where they're moving from the high risk to the moderate risk, and then so the moderate risk pool is much larger than the high risk, where before the high risk was larger. And so the trend is moving in the right direction. As far as individual behavior and measuring that, coaching, like you were talking about, is not taken off quite the way that I would like to see it take off, because when someone has a good coach, it can really help get to those intrinsic motivations and what but you need to be in a space to be ready to change. And so having enough awareness of the issue and why it should be important to you, and then having someone be vulnerable enough, or if you are vulnerable enough to reach out to a coach and say, here's why it's important to me, and it's usually a pretty personal reason. So I think that is what does move the needle a bit, but people need to be ready for that, and so to get to that readiness is the hard part.
Great. So stay on track. I thought we would open up to the audience and take, general questions and see what people, question.
So I'm one of the avid user of metrics, I went to 23andMe when they opened, and I've got a Fitbit which I sleep with and live with, and I measure my blood pressure and all that. And I think one of the issues that I'm running into, so we have consumers that are really running and accepting all these ways that you can actually monitor yourself, and then you go to your doctor, they don't care. I mean, where they go back to measuring your blood pressure and so on and so forth. And to me, it's like, when are you going to see, it seems like it's moving faster at the consumer level than actually the medical profession is really taking it in and doing anything with it. So how do you see those two moving parallel or coming together at some point?
So much the question is it seems like that consumer-based monitoring is outpacing the information that healthcare professionals
Are willing to use and absorb, yes.
Anybody? Steve?
So I would say there's two key things there at least. One is that the physicians want proof, and there's not a lot of proof. So in mobile health stuff, I guess there's a lot of commercial activity, but not that many papers showing that these things have sustainable long-term effects. And the second is that they're concerned about time. And so most of them aren't particularly interested in having people come into their office bringing stacks of stuff that's going to take more time. And so those are two areas that I think need work. But there's a lot of opportunity to bring them together.
There's a third component. I totally agree with what Steve said, but you also have to keep in mind risk. So physicians, like if you walk in with like your 23andMe data, the physician has to sort of, if they don't spend a lot of time looking at, and let's be clear that most physicians do not have a background in genetics. Most physicians don't have a background in nutrition. So you're expecting an interaction where you bring your SNPs to them and they look at it and they go, oh, goodness gracious, you're at risk for A, B, and C. Let's create a plan around that. They don't know how to interpret the data any more effectively than you do. I mean, they do, but not at a much more expert level. So that just puts them at risk. Because now they have data in front of them that if they've missed something, you could go back and hit them with a lawsuit about it. So they're actually really nervous about this at a sort of global level. Now, of course, you have individual physicians who greatly embrace this, and and a lot of these physicians are spitting out the new types of systems. The accountable care organizations are going to change things dramatically for the better, I think, in the long run, because they'll be paid on outcomes rather than just for services. But this will take some time to evolve. We've created a legal and risk management infrastructure around how medicine's delivered that makes it very difficult to innovate. I was saying to somebody earlier that evidence base is the way to say, I don't want to do anything. Because until it's evidence based, which means pretty much beyond the pale of any shadow of a doubt, I don't need to take that risk and innovate against it because I'm at risk. And in some cases they are. Some of it's perception, but in some cases it is. So it's going to be a challenge. I don't see it getting fixed anytime soon. The other fact is that most electronic medical record systems are really not set up to do much with this data. They're snapshots at a given time. They're not dynamical. They don't really offer a lot of value. And we force physicians into a role of data entry rather than sort of giving them the gestalt of what's important. And it's a very challenging scenario for them.
So I'll often, I don't know if there are the physicians, are there any physicians who want to comment on that? So I'll tell you, do you have
Well, just that, yes, they are a data entry system, not necessarily.
So my perspective is I agree with you, and so it's interesting, the question you asked me, is an excellent question, because as you asked it, my mind jumped to something completely different than the way you guys answered the question, which is, so there's two ways, so because monitoring to me, by definition, requires a serial assessment, okay? So there's certain, like 23andMe is not serial, it's one time, so I would not have thought of 23andMe, even though you mentioned it as monitoring. So the thing I was thinking about, I thought you were talking about like other things that you assess about your body, in a very general terms, I check my vision 10 times a day, or I check my hearing, or I check my whatever. So for instance, you're both right, is that physicians need to use validated tests because otherwise they cannot communicate with other physicians with non-validated things. So for instance, a very commonly used thing is called the 6-minute walk test. Okay? It's been validated over and over again using drug studies for drug approvals, which is basically, how far you can walk in 6 minutes. It's been shown over and over again to work. So if you say my 6-minute walk test time is 37 feet, everybody understands what that means, plus or minus some error. Okay. In terms of I'll call it a molecular monitoring device, I think you're both absolutely right, and that's one of the challenges that comes like Indy has is it's education. It's not even understanding. Everybody understands what the clinical challenge is, but there's so much that to them that is really understanding not only why you're doing this, but how do I interpret the result, even when it's presented in a clinically relatively clear way or purposely presented in a clear way. And then that adoption is actually, to your point, is actually about sort of lack of knowledge, and also, as you're alluding to, taking the time to bother, which is very difficult when people have 12 minutes to see patients, which is ridiculous in itself.
Well, and I would just add that, fundamentally, the system needs to shift in a pretty dramatic way, and here's sort of 3 big drivers to think about. One is we as individuals just need to accept the fact that much like in the 70s, there was a change from a pension-driven approach to our retirements to a 401k-driven approach to our retirements. And the fact that we own something about our retirement that we need to track. You can hire a financial advisor to help you, whatever, but there's some personal responsibility there. You have to understand that ultimately your personal health and your healthcare costs are intertwined, and you need to take some responsibility for it as an individual and as a community and as a family. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying that there's not enormous extrinsic challenges to doing that, but that's a fundamental mind shift that we need to have. Once that's in place, you start to realize that, this is really complicated. This data is really hard to interpret, and I'm not sure what to do that. But physicians play a specific role in our healthcare system, but they're not the only role. There are coaches, there are nutritionists, there are dietitians, there are physical trainers. There are all sorts of people who could work with you in specific ways on certain areas of health that have a different cost structure, have a different approach, and would allow physicians to focus on that which they need. Now that's a change in our mindset about the physician being sort of the omniscient being in my health and looking at a broader team-based approach. And frankly, it's already moving that way. Nurse practitioners and physician's assistants are playing an incredible role in broadening the perspective of the medical system. And I think a lot of what's going to happen around outcomes-based treatment will force a change because it's simply going to be too expensive to go see your doctor for good nutritional counseling. It just doesn't make any sense. So I think all those changes are going to lead to ability to use your data in a good way versus kind of stuck today, which is you're stuck trying to figure out what to do with it.
Why don't we take another question?
So in the context of a 100K product, where do you find that many people are willing to go through the tedium of tracking so many different variables over such a long time? Because like you mentioned, everyone has like specific issues. So like for myself, I don't have any issues with blood glucose. I wouldn't want to like wear a continuous glucose monitor and have to calibrate it twice a year. If I don't have any digestive issues, I wouldn't want to put up with taking regular stool samples.
Yeah.
How do you? So somebody's question is Sean, it sounds like are people willing to sign up for a 20-year, somewhat, commitment to do this type of study?
Well, it's an excellent question, and the short answer is we don't know, but I'll give a slightly longer answer. And the slightly longer answer is what we do know. We spent a lot of time looking at really successful longitudinal studies. And what we found is that there's 3 to 4 characteristics that make for good longitudinal studies where people are willing to commit and give biomaterials. One is a sense of mission. People really are enamored by, so the UK Biobank, for example, or the Framingham study are good examples. There was a series of interviews about why people stayed engaged with the Framingham study. And some of these people are taking a day off from work, driving 4 to 5 hours because they don't live in the immediate vicinity anymore, spending half a day to give all sorts of biosampling for no discernible value to them. But they want to make the lives of their children and their children's children better, and so they know by contributing this, they're doing that. So that sense of mission is really important. 2 is, as I've talked about a lot, is building that sense of engagement from a coaching perspective. we're not asking anyone to monitor themselves continuously. What we are asking them to do is, giving blood and giving biosamples every 3 months. And we're also trying to be smart about things. Like, we know people won't wear their Fitbits continually. We're dealing with a lot of complaints. It's not working, it's not uploading correctly,
I lost it.
I lost it. I mean, God, I can't tell you how many lost. But what we have asked people to do instead is to wear 1 week for every month. And that's worked much better. We're getting, 67% compliance on Fitbit, and that's the lowest compliance rate that we have right now.
Another question?
Follow up to that, Sean. Don't most people who want to be in those studies care about their health? And so they have that commitment, and you want to track disease. Wouldn't you want the unhealthy people in those studies more than the healthy people?
Yes, and let me say 2 things. One is you're assuming that someone who thinks they're healthy actually are healthy. And what we know from, I can tell you from the data we've seen on our 108, these are not randomly chosen people. This is just an early study, right? These were friends of
Then
these.
let me restructure that. People who believe they're taking care of themselves, who are eating better, they're exercising, more than the general population.
Yes.
So the question could be, are you asking, is there inherent self-referral study bias?
Clearly, and where we are right now, yes. So one of the things that we are looking to do to improve on this is we're hoping to tap into existing longitudinal studies like the Black Women Study in Atlanta and the Jackson studies in Mississippi and Atlanta and the Framingham study, and tap into their larger bases that have a much broader pull than what we're going to do here, and be able to use that as one area. We're also in discussions. 15 different countries have approached us and said, hey, we want to be members of the 100K now. It's not going to work out for a wide variety of reasons, but we're expecting 4 to 5 countries. Most of those are single-payer systems located across the world, and so it's a different mentality than what we have here. If you're asking me ideally what I would like to see happen is I would love to have Medicaid moms from Arkansas in this program, and I think eventually it's going to happen. How it's going to happen is probably going to be the same way that the Human Genome Project took place, which is a group of scientists will develop a collaboration to approach Congress and ask for a multi-billion-dollar investment in the Human Wellness Project that will span over many years. That succeeded with the Human Genome Project. That one project was $2.8 billion in investment and has created $700 billion in commercial value in its lifetime to date.
Question?
So as sensors become cheaper and measurement becomes more ubiquitous, especially passive measurements, what do you think are the risks to the accumulated body of data, especially in terms of like breaches? And also, what do you think about avoidance strategies? You mentioned the person wouldn't step on the scale if they knew they were going to get a bad number. What do you see are some of the challenges to overcome, and what are some of the potential misapplications of these bodies of data as they become collected?
So to summarize the first question, is really the risk of accumulating data, and the second is potential misuse of the data.
Sure.
So this comes up every time I give a talk, and normally I have slides and I show data, and so then it's even more certain to come up. Because if you're talking about your mobile phone knowing what you're doing, obviously that could be used for good or bad. It's essentially like any technology. So there clearly would have to be as much security built into the system as possible, but that's not, in my opinion, not going to be enough. And so ultimately you have to have laws that protect it up to a point, and there's going to always be a certain risk. One of the things that would help is if we had a more logical system where employers, for example, were not involved in our healthcare. That makes it a little bit less risky to talk about your health situation in some cases, but I think it's a risk-benefits trade-off. And one of the things I know you would see is as your computer knows more about what you're doing, it's going to do a lot of other things for you that are not about health that you're going to like. And so, sort of personal management types of things, right? Or entertainment types of things. And that'll mean that people will be willing to put up with this, again, this sort of risk-benefit trade-off, and the benefits will be high. So if the only benefit is monitoring, you kind of get back to the same thing. I don't want to step on the scale. Maybe I don't want to know there's a problem. So then I might say, I'm not going to do it because I'm worried about the security. But if it's doing other things for you, and at the same time it's allowing you to, potentially stay healthy, you're more likely to do it. But it's absolutely an issue, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be exploring what the possibilities are and then thinking about as a society, how do we properly protect people's information.
It's a
Chrissy, was that, at an organizational level, that must be an issue.
That's definitely an issue. Anytime an employer asks their employees to participate in a biometric screening, the number one, opposition is, what are you doing with my data? I don't want my employer to have this type of data. And the employers are getting it on an aggregate level. They're using an outside vendor where they don't report aggregately if there are less than 50 people, because they might be able to pinpoint who people are. But people just don't understand that. They're always worried that their employer is going to get some kind of private health information about them, and they don't want it.
Well, I know with like health assessments, what commonly happens is that an employee thinks it'll be tracked to them, that is lying, right? But as sensors become more passive, where the data is just collected where they want it, I mean, what do you see are some of the I mean, I agree that you can sort of decouple and move towards this sort of personal accountability system. How do you think that will work in terms of incentives or avoidance strategies, and how do you see the system evolving towards that individualized focus?
So I think people, again, being offered coaching, if they fall into a certain category, the employer puts it out there for anyone who's interested. They have to call the outside party and see if they qualify, because the employer doesn't want to know that information about people. I think the more people understand that it's a third party, employer's not involved, I think that will help. But
Is there some legal issues there, so the employer doesn't want to know?
There are legal issues, HIPAA, the health information privacy laws. So there are also
Like
American with
it's
Disabilities.
Like a fitness thing where it's just tracking weight or how many steps you walk, would that be protected too? I know there's several companies even in.
It's about whether it's linked to an identified location, that's where it's coming. It's not the data per se, it's really how it's linked to the.
Yeah, but like if applied to like, fit step counts.
Yeah, you could, sure. It doesn't take such a linkage. Maybe it's time for one final question.
How about all of this data's ability to drive public policy? I mean, you see the movement away from cigarettes, obviously. It seems like there's some environmental factors right now that are pretty obviously, fried chicken, for instance, bad for people. So what are your thoughts on that?
The last question is, how might this data influence public policy?
So wellness plan, part of the public policy of the Affordable Care Act is that employers can now incent employees with the premiums. It used to be 20%, now it's up to 30% of employer share of premium, and for smokers it's 50%. So that's one example of where wellness incentives have been influenced, or have influenced public policy and vice versa.
Simple example is that in a relatively large population of people, you knew where they were really getting physical activity and whether or not that was in, say, public settings like parks. There's a lot of interest in that, right? So to justify whether or not you should build a park, it would be nice to have evidence about whether or not that actually has much impact on people. And right now, we don't have great ways of measuring it. So, I think anytime you have better scientific data on what people are doing, it could influence public policy. I think just one thing I want to say is sort of in a conversation like this, the fried chicken example, right? I think you have to be very careful because most dietitians would say it's not. The problem is sort of excess and things, and so it's not just about fried chicken. So fried chicken, it'd be very unlikely that you'd come down with and say KFC, you're out of business, right? Because
But you could potentially tax trans fat, so you could tax something that was showing up in the data as having a huge negative.
sure, but I think it's probably unlikely
Or
because
you tax self-subsidizing.
Because if you look at the chart of preventable deaths in the United States, smoking is the absolute top one. Obesity, sort of, we're not really sure about it, right? And we could just outlaw cigarettes, and we haven't. And so I would.
But we've
Could
taken
that
steps to incentivize people away from it. Right?
Yes, we have, but that's different than outlawing it, right?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm not suggesting that, just incentive.
Sure. I mean, the whole thing with choice architecture and nudging people in directions, having good evidence that these things are important might lead to that sort of thing.
Sure.
We can continue this discussion, the reception in the back, but I wanted to take a minute to thank our speakers, WBBA, Ken Fang, my colleague at Moderator Diagnostics, Christy from Parkersville, Stephen Tilly from Northeastern, and Sean Bell from ISB. ISB, and all of you. This has been a great discussion, and I'm really thrilled to have everyone here.